Hey everybody, as requested, here's a quick overview of the kidney and paying particular attention to this thing called the nephron. So we've got here the kidney, stuff that we've seen before. We've seen this as the renal capsule, just the outside sort of part here. If we cut into the kidney, you can see we've got a couple of layers. This outside layer here is the renal cortex, and the inside sort of layer, this darker sort of spots here, make up what we call the renal medulla. Inside here is the renal pelvis, and we've got some blood vessels coming in and out. Blood is carried into the kidney via the renal artery and carried out of the kidney via the renal vein. And of course, draining the urine that's produced by the kidney is taken out of the blood and it's drained away from the kidney via the, again, renal pelvis, but then drained out to these tubes called, well, this one called the ureter. But of course, we've got two typically of these kidneys. So yeah, we've got two ureters, and that drains into the bladder and eventually out of the body. Okay, we're going to take a cross section here, and this is where we start seeing this thing called the nephron, because as we zoom into this part here, and this is sort of cutting across both the renal cortex and into the renal medulla, you can see that we've got these really tiny, tiny tubes here. And just this one system, this one tube here that dips down and back up and has all these little squiggly lines, this is what we call a nephron. And here's a second nephron there. You can kind of see how it cuts, starting here from the cortex and down into the renal medulla and back up into the renal cortex again. That's a nephron, all right? So that's what we're going to be talking about. I did draw your attention to the fact that we've got blood coming into here. Again, the renal artery and then out through the renal vein. Um, and this is, let's just draw your attention to the next slide. All right. Uh, just to let you know, because people were asking about this, so the blood comes from the heart. This is blood that's being pumped from the heart. And you can see that as it leaves the lungs and goes into the left atrium, left ventricle, and out. So this is going out of the heart, leaving the heart as oxygenated blood. You can kind of see that that blood gets diverted to different parts here. Like we've got some going to heart, muscle, bones, blah, 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 skin. There, kidneys. And I guess they're saying 22% of the blood volume that leaves the heart gets pushed into the kidneys. And that would be via that, again, the renal artery, and then leaving the kidneys via the renal vein, back up through and into the right atrium of the of the lungs, of the heart, ventricle, and then getting reoxygenated that way. So this is how it sort of circulates, but again, just to let you know just how this sort of fits in with the rest of the circulatory system. All right? All right. All right, let's take a look and get our bearings here. This is the nephron, and like we said, this, if I was trying to draw this out here, this sort of section in here. This part in here is the part of the kidney that we call, again, the renal cortex. It's that outermost layer there, and underneath it is the renal medulla. And you can see that this nephron, just this one tube here, there's thousands, hundreds of thousands of these tubes that will cut across and through here and back out. And there's a reason for that. We'll get into that in a sec. All right, so let's take a look at just what is happening here. And we'll start off with this thing called the Bowman's capsule. The Bowman's capsule is sort of, let's do this here. The Bowman's capsule is really this sort of thing there. Inside of it, and we can sometimes call this the glomerular capsule as well. That's what it's been sometimes, it can be called. And the reason why it's called the glomerular capsule is because really this thing inside of this mesh tubes here, is the glomerulus. You also have this thing here. Oh, we're not going to talk about the arteries and veins just yet. But let's take a look at this thing. This first part of the tube, this part that sort of leaves the Bowman's capsule and sort of snakes its way down through here. The first sort of area is called the proximal tubule. And the filtrate, the stuff that's taken away from the blood, sort of snakes its way down through here, down the descending limb of the loop. Oops, the loop of Henle. So this thing here is the loop of Henle. Down and back up the ascending limb, and it gets to this thing called, here, the distal tubule. And snakes up through here from the ascending limb to the distal tubule, and eventually it goes out to this thing called the collecting duct. And you can kind of see the collecting duct here has these other sort of branches, and those are to indicate where other sort of nephrons are emptying out into. So this collecting duct here is connected to a bunch of other nephrons that will eventually take this filtrate from the blood and is basically now urine, and it will sort of deposit that stuff into the renal pelvis and eventually out of the out to the ureters and into the bladder. All right, now let's talk a little bit about what's happening here. Wow, that was not the eraser. This is the eraser. And for some reason, can't do it. Fantastic. All right, well, we're going to do it this way anyway. Forget that. We're going to talk about blood here, and what better way to talk about or represent blood than with the color blue. Sorry, that's all I have left in my palette. As you can see, I have already used the red color, so I'm stuck with blue. We're going to trace a little bit of what's happening here with the blood. Like we said, the blood is taken taken to the kidney via the renal artery. And that renal artery goes into the kidney and branches off into smaller and smaller tubes or vessels to these things called arterioles. And what let's say this arteriole here is, there's my little hand there. That is where the blood's going to go into, let's say. We would call that the afferent arteriole. But really what that is that's blood that's come from the renal vein. Again, it's been broken down into several sort of smaller tubes, but the blood that we're getting here is the blood that's from the heart taken to the kidney via the renal artery and into this thing called the afferent arteriole. And that blood gets pushed into this mesh of tubes that we called, again, the glomerulus. And that glomerulus is really almost like it's got tiny sort of holes that allows only specific materials to get pushed out, basically filtered out of the blood. And the rest of the stuff that doesn't get filtered out basically gets carried away from or out of that glomerular capsule or Bowman's capsule, and it gets carried away and out of this thing called the efferent arteriole, which eventually will go, will actually snake around. So let's use my blue pen here. So we're going to do this now. The blood would then go through here and get filtered out and out the efferent arteriole. And this vessel actually will sort of loop back in and around. And this, I'm going to try to be really artistic here. Like that. And back maybe this way. And this way. And this way. And sure, it's going to snake its way down this way and out. And eventually, that would go out to connect up with other efferent arterioles and eventually out to this thing called the renal vein. So that's kind of the pathway of blood. And it kind of makes sense that the blood vessel would sort of, or this arterioles would sort of snake around this nephron, because basically they're going to be there to collect up anything that gets tossed out of this nephron. So if this nephron is sort of letting go of like salts and water and other stuff that gets sort of either actively or passively transported out of this nephron, all right, the blood's going to collect it up so it can stay in the body, because that's how it's going to keep it in the body and move it around. All right, so that kind of makes sense that you'd have this system of blood vessels, again, starting originally from the renal artery into this set of arterioles, these smaller sort of vessels, and into the glomerular capsule. Back out, this blood would come out, back out. This vessel would then travel and snake around through here to recollect up anything that this nephron allows to sort of actively or passively transport out of the nephron, and it will go back into the blood. It's collected back up into the blood. That's how this all works. And eventually that blood gets pushed out to the renal vein and back up to the heart, where it can then be redistributed around the body. So that's just the blood. All right, next, let's talk about the actual filtration and the cleaning of the blood altogether.